The air in the sanctum was a perfect, measured thing. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, carried no temperature. It was simply a presence, a sterile medium filling the space between the polished chrome steel walls and the soft, white luminescence that bled from the ceiling panels. Elian sat before the vanity, a sheet of mirrored glass that reflected a stranger he had been taught to recognize as himself. The reflection was flawless, skin-scrubbed and polished to the texture of pearl, hair the color of spun moonlight, eyes a placid, genetically approved shade of violet. He was a composition, a carefully curated collection of desirable traits, an asset. Tomorrow, that asset would be formally transferred to the custodianship of High Counselor Alistair Vane. They called it a union. Elian understood it as a transaction, the final seal on a contract drafted before his conception. He raised a hand, his own, and watched the reflection mimic the gesture. The fingers were long, elegant, the nails buffed to a dull sheen. He touched the cool surface of the mirror, his skin meeting the cold, unyielding image of his skin. There was no connection. A faint tremor ran through his fingers, the only betrayal of the placid facade. The system abhorred such tremors. They were imperfections, data points indicating emotional dysregulation. He drew his hand back, folding it into his lap atop the heavy, ceremonial silk of his bonding robes. The fabric was weightless, and yet it felt like an anchor, pinning him to the bio-foam cushion. A soft chime, melodic and precise, echoed through the sanctum. The door slid open with a sigh of compressed air. Alistair entered. He moved with the same measured grace as the world he commanded. His uniform, a stark, architectural black against the room's pervasive white. His face was handsome in a severe, symmetrical way, his expression one of calm authority. He was the pinnacle of alpha genetics, just as Elian was the pinnacle of Omega design. Together, they were the future of the Concordance, a perfect, predictable future. Elian, he said. His voice was like the air, temperate and without inflection. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of presence, like noting a piece of art had been hung correctly on a wall. Alistair. Elian's own voice was a soft echo, trained to be pleasing and unobtrusive. He did not rise. Protocol dictated he remain seated, a receptive vessel. Alistair approached, his polished boots making no sound on the sound-dampening floor. He stopped behind Elian, and for a moment their two reflections were captured together in the mirror. The Alpha, dark and powerful. The Omega, light and delicate. A perfect contrast. A perfect pairing. He was not looking at Elian. He was looking at their combined image, assessing its aesthetic and symbolic value. The preparations are complete, Alistair stated. The genetic sequencing for the first cycle progeny has been approved by the Council. The probability of success is rated at 98.7%. He spoke of their future child as one might speak of a successful corporate merger. Elian felt nothing. He was supposed to feel pride, a sense of purpose fulfilled. He had been told this for years, the words imprinted over his consciousness like a watermark. You are the key. You are the vessel. You are the future. But the words were hollow, and inside him was only a vast, silent emptiness. Alistair placed a small, white case on the vanity beside Elian's still hand. It opened with a click, revealing a single, needle-thin ampoule filled with a clear liquid. A final gift, Alistair said, his gaze finally meeting Elian's in the mirror. To ensure your comfort during the ceremony, a state-of-the-art inhibitor. It will neutralize any residual scent markers. The process must be pure, unmarred by biological distractions. Elian stared at the ampule. He was already on a regimen of inhibitors, daily doses that scrubbed his natural scent from the air, rendering him a biological blank slate. It was for his own protection, they said, to prevent emotional contagion, to maintain order. But this one was different. He could feel its potency even through the glass, a cold promise of absolute erasure. His scent, the one true thing that was his own, was a ghost he could sometimes feel, but never perceive. The inhibitors had been a part of his life for so long that he could not remember what he was supposed to smell like. He only knew the absence of it was a constant, low-level ache deep in his bones. This new dose felt like a finality, a tombstone. "It will guarantee a seamless integration," Alistair continued, his voice a smooth, persuasive drone. No distractions, no instinctual dissonance, just pure, logical union. He placed his hand on Elian's shoulder. The touch was firm, possessive. It was not unkind, but it was utterly devoid of warmth. It was the touch of an owner assessing his property. In the mirror, the stranger with violet eyes looked back at him, placid and still. But deep inside, something small and terrified began to beat its wings against the cage of his ribs. A tremor, larger this time, that he could not suppress. Alistair's fingers tightened slightly, a silent command to be still, to be perfect. And Elian, as he had been trained to do his entire life, obeyed. He reached for the ampule, his movements fluid and graceful. The perfect Omega, accepting the final key to his own gilded prison. He did not see the subtle flicker in Alistair's eyes, a glint of satisfaction, of a final variable brought under absolute control. The transaction was almost complete. The asset was secure. Elian was not an asset. The thought was a heresy, a flicker of static in the clean signal of his conditioning. It rose from a place so deep he didn't know it existed. He was not an experiment. He was not a vessel. The words repeated, a silent, frantic mantra behind his placid expression as he prepared the dermal applicator. He was something else. He just didn't know what. But as the applicator hissed against the pale skin of his neck, delivering the cold, final negation of himself, he felt a profound and terrifying sense of loss, as if the last ember of a fire he never knew he had was being extinguished forever. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the weight of all the things he would never be. He was a ghost in his own life, a spectre haunting the sterile corridors of his own existence. The memory of touch was an abstraction, a concept he understood from training modules, but could not recall as a sensation. His life was a series of reflections, in the polished floors, in the mirrored walls of the transit tubes, in the dark, silent screens of the data slates he was given for enrichment. He saw himself constantly, a perfect, pale figure, moving through a perfect, pale world. But he never felt himself. The conditioning had been thorough. It began in the creche, a place of soft lights and softer voices, where contact was limited to nutrient administrators and bio-monitors. Affection was a variable deemed too unpredictable for stable development. His world was one of sensory deprivation disguised as purity. The scent neutralizers in the air vents hummed a constant, low lullaby, ensuring no errant pheromones could trigger an unsanctioned emotional response. The food was nutrient-paced, optimized for growth, devoid of texture or taste. Even the fabrics he wore were chosen for their lack of tactile stimulation. He was a plant in a hydroponic chamber, given everything he needed to grow according to specification, and nothing more. He remembered one of the educators, a woman with kind eyes that never quite reached the rest of her face. Her designation was Administrator 7. She had been explaining the symbiotic relationship between alpha and omega dynamics, using a holographic display of two celestial bodies locked in a perfect gravitational dance. The omega provides the stable emotional core, she had said, her voice a soothing monotone. A center of gravity around which the alpha's ambition and strength can orbit without flying into chaos. You are the silence in the storm, Elian, the stillness at the heart of progress. She had almost touched his hand then. Her fingers had hovered over his, a breath away, and for a startling, terrifying second, Elian had wanted to feel it. He had wanted to know if her skin was warm. The impulse was so alien, so powerful, it had made him flinch. Administrator 7 had withdrawn her hand immediately, her expression resetting to a neutral state. A note was made on her data slate. Subject exhibits minor tactile seeking behavior. Recommend recalibration of environmental stimuli. The next day, the temperature in his quarters was lowered by 2 degrees, and the texture of his sleep linens was made even smoother, even more frictionless. He learned not to want. It was a lesson taught through absence. He was a beautiful, empty vessel, polished and prepared for the great purpose of his union. He would be filled with Alistair's ambition, with his genetic code, with the future of the concordance. That was his function. That was his honor. Now, with the new inhibitor coursing through his veins, even the ghost of his own scent was gone. The internal ache had vanished, replaced by a profound and unsettling numbness. It was as if a part of his soul had been surgically removed. He felt lighter. He felt hollower. He stood and walked to the immense window that formed the sanctum's far wall. It was not glass, but a dynamic pane of smart crystal, currently polarized to near total opacity, showing only a soft, uniform white light. Tomorrow, it would be programmed to display a simulation of a dawn sky, a poetic backdrop for the commencement of the ceremony. There was no real dawn in the upper sectors of the concordance, only the regulated cycle of lumen panels. He placed his palm against the smooth, cool surface. He could feel the faint, subsonic vibration of the city's life support systems, a constant, deep hum that was the planet's true heartbeat. He wondered what was on the other side, not the simulated dawn, but the truth. He had seen archival footage of the world before the concordance, the wild times, a chaotic, unhygienic mess of organic life, dirt, rain, unregulated wind, animals with scents that were overpowering, pheromones that drove them to unpredictable, violent acts. It was a horror story they showed to children to make them grateful for the clean, controlled world they lived in. But sometimes, in the deep cycle of his sleep, he dreamed of it. He dreamed of the color green, a shade more vibrant than any he had ever seen. He dreamed of the feeling of wetness on his skin that was not the recycled water of the purification chamber. He dreamed of a scent wild and sharp, like crushed leaves and cold air. He would wake from these dreams with his heart beating a frantic, unsanctioned rhythm, a sheen of sweat on his skin. He would report the dreams, as was protocol, and his nutrient paste would be adjusted. The dreams would fade, but the memory of them lingered, a strange, forbidden warmth in the cold void of his being. The chime sounded again. Not Alistair this time. It was a servitor, a silent chrome automaton that glided into the room carrying a nutrient dispenser, his final meal before the union. Fortified with calming agents and electrolytes, the servitor extended the tube. Elian took it, his movements graceful, practiced. He was not hungry. He was never hungry. He merely consumed fuel. He drank the paste, the bland, slightly viscous fluid coating his tongue. He was a machine being prepared for a critical function. Fuel, calibration, final checks. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. He returned the empty dispenser to the servitor, which retracted its arm and glided silently from the room. The door sighed shut, sealing him once more in his perfect white prison. He turned back to the mirror, to the stranger with his face. The violet eyes were wide, unnaturally clear from the calming agents. They looked empty, entirely and completely empty. He was ready. He was null. He was a perfect, beautiful nothing. And in the absolute, pristine silence of the sanctum, he thought he heard the sound of something breaking. Not a loud sound, a tiny, distant crack like a hairline fracture appearing in a sheet of flawless glass. He dismissed it, an auditory hallucination, a side effect of the new inhibitor. The system was perfect. The sanctum was impenetrable. Nothing ever broke in the concordance. The sound came again, louder this time, a sharp, percussive impact that vibrated through the floor, a dissonance in the sanctum's sterile harmony. It was not a hallucination. It was real. Elian froze, his hand hovering over the silk of his robes. His conditioning screamed at him. Remain calm. Await instruction. This is a drill. This is a test. But his body, that treacherous vessel of instinct, did not obey. A tremor started in his core, a low-frequency vibration of pure, unadulterated fear. The system did not have drills like this. The system did not have errors. Then the world exploded. The smart crystal window, the one that was supposed to show him a simulated dawn, shattered, not into pieces, but into a million glittering shards of light and crystalline dust that hung in the air for a microsecond before being blasted inwards by a sudden, violent decompression. A hurricane of sensation ripped through the room. Cold. The air was brutally, shockingly cold. And it was wet. It carried a scent so complex, so overwhelming, that Elian's sterilized senses reeled. It smelled of ozone, of rain-soaked earth, of something metallic and sharp like blood, and beneath it all, something else, something wild and alive. Pine needles after a frost, the musk of a living, breathing predator. A figure landed in the center of the room, rolling with an animal grace that was utterly alien. It was a man, an alpha, but unlike any alpha Elian had ever seen. He was not clad in the severe, clean lines of a concordance uniform. He wore rugged, dark gear that seemed to be made of leather and reinforced plating, scarred and worn. Rainwater slicked his dark hair to his skull, and his face was smeared with something that looked like mud and defiance. He rose to his full height, and the sterile sanctum seemed to shrink around him, suddenly too small, too fragile to contain such a raw, untamed presence. The intruder's eyes scanned the room, quick and assessing, before they landed on Elian, and held. They were eyes the color of a stormy sky, and they burned with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Elian couldn't breathe. The air he had just inhaled, this new, wild air, was trapped in his lungs. All his training, all his conditioning, evaporated in the face of that stare. He was no longer a calm, placid Omega. He was prey. He was a target. The Alpha took a step forward, his heavy boots crunching on the glittering dust of the shattered window. The sound was a desecration. He moved with a purpose that was terrifying. He was a vector of chaos, a walking embodiment of the wild times from the archives. And his scent, it rolled off him in waves, a potent, undiluted pheromonal signature that bypassed every chemical barrier in Elian's system. It was the scent from his dreams, magnified 1,000 times. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It was everything he had been taught to fear and deny. Alarms began to blare, a high-pitched, frantic shriek that was quickly silenced by a device the intruder crushed under his heel. He never took his eyes off Elian. He took another step. Elian finally found his legs. He scrambled backward, his silk robes tangling around his feet. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the vanity. The reflection in the mirror showed a creature he didn't recognize. Eyes wide with terror, body coiled like a frightened animal. The calm, perfect Omega was gone, shattered along with the window. The intruder stopped, tilting his head. A low sound rumbled in his chest, not quite a word, but a vibration of intent. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, and his gaze sharpened as if he were focusing on something Elian couldn't see, as if he were tasting the air around Elian, the air that was supposed to be a perfect, scentless void. "They hide it," the man growled, his voice a rough, gravelly thing that scraped against the silence. "They try to bury it under all this nothing." He gestured dismissively at the white room, the polished chrome, the whole sterile artifice of Elian's life. "But I can still smell it, faint, like a flower under a sheet of ice." He took a final, deliberate step, closing the distance between them until he was looming over Elian. Elian pressed himself against the vanity, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. He could feel the heat radiating from the man's body. He could see the pulse beating in the strong column of his throat. He was so intensely, overwhelmingly real. It was too much. Sensory overload. His carefully regulated world had been reduced to this one terrifying point of focus. The Alpha reached out, not with violence, but with a strange, deliberate slowness. His fingers were calloused, stained with dirt. They were the antithesis of Alistair's smooth, manicured hands. He reached for Elian's face. Elian flinched, a violent, full-body shudder, squeezing his eyes shut. He braced for a blow, for the end. But the touch, when it came, was not what he expected. The man's thumb brushed against the spot on his neck where the dermal applicator had delivered the final inhibitor. The touch was rough, but it was surprisingly gentle. It sent a jolt through Elian's system, a cascade of neural signals so powerful it was almost painful. It was the first real, unsanctioned human touch he had felt in his entire conscious life. His eyes snapped open. The Alpha was staring at him, his stormy eyes filled with a strange mix of fury and something else, something that looked like recognition, like he had found something he had been searching for, a lost thing. The rumbling sound started in his chest again, deeper this time, more resonant. It coalesced into a single guttural word, a claim, a declaration that defied all logic, all protocol, all the sterile order of the concordance. Mine. The word was a shockwave. It did not just enter Elian's ears. It resonated in the hollow spaces inside him, in the marrow of his bones. It was a primal frequency that his body understood even if his mind could not. Mine. It was possessive, savage, absolute, and it was the most real thing he had ever heard. For a single, suspended moment, the universe consisted only of the Alpha's rough thumb against his skin and the echo of that word in his soul. Then the sanctum doors hissed open, not with the quiet deference of a servitor's arrival, but blasted inward, torn from their magnetic locks. Two concordance enforcers, clad in white armor and visored helmets, stormed into the room, their pulse rifles raised. "Asset is compromised," one shouted, the voice a tinny distortion through his helmet speaker. "Subdue the hostile." The Alpha, Kale, Elian would later learn his name was Kale, moved with impossible speed. He was no longer a predator observing its prey. He was a force of nature unleashed. He shoved Elian behind him, a protective, instinctive gesture that was as shocking as his claim. The air cracked with the sound of a pulse rifle discharge, a bolt of incandescent energy searing a black scar across the wall where Elian had been standing a second before. Kyle was a blur of dark motion. He slammed the butt of a brutal-looking kinetic pistol into the first enforcer's visor, shattering it and sending the man stumbling back. He deflected the second enforcer's rifle with his forearm, the armored plating of his gear sparking, and drove a blade into the articulated joint of the man's armor at his shoulder. The enforcer screamed, a choked, wet sound, and collapsed. It was over in seconds. The violence was brutal, efficient, and horrifying. Elian stared at the two crumpled white forms on the floor, his mind struggling to process the scene. The sterile white was now stained with blood. The perfect order was a chaotic ruin. Kale turned back to him, his chest heaving slightly. There was a fresh cut on his cheek, a bright line of red against his skin. His eyes were wild, alight with the fire of combat. He grabbed Elian's arm, his grip strong and unyielding. "We're leaving," he snarled, his voice low and urgent. Elian's body refused to move. He was paralyzed by the collision of two opposing realities, the ordered, predictable world he knew, and this sudden, violent chaos, his conditioning warred with a new, terrified instinct. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. The Union." "There is no Union," Kyle bit out, his grip tightening. He pulled Elian toward the shattered window. "That's not a Union. It's an erasure." The cold night air blasted Elian's face as they reached the ledge. He looked down. The city sprawled below, a breathtaking, terrifying vista of light and shadow, a geometric web of towers and transit ways that stretched to the horizon. They were hundreds of stories up. "I can't," he gasped, his fear finally finding its voice. He pulled back, digging his heels in. Kyle didn't release him. Instead, he wrapped a powerful arm around Elian's waist, hauling him flush against his body. Elian's face was pressed against the rough, cold leather of Kale's gear. He was surrounded by the Alpha's scent, a dizzying, overwhelming storm of pine and ozone and raw male power. It should have been terrifying. It was. But beneath the terror, something else stirred. A strange, frightening sense of safety, of being held. "Hold on," Kyle grunted. He fired a cable from a device on his wrist. It shot out into the darkness, the hook at its end biting into the facade of a neighboring tower with a shower of sparks. Elian's world tilted as Kale leaped from the ledge, pulling them both out into the vast, empty night. A scream tore from Elian's throat, a raw, animal sound he didn't know he was capable of making. The wind ripped at him, a physical assault that stole his breath. The city lights blurred into streaks below them as they swung in a dizzying arc through the abyss between the towers. He clung to Kale, his finely manicured nails digging into the man's shoulders, his face buried in the crook of his neck. He was no longer the perfect Omega. He was no longer an asset. He was a terrified creature, falling through the sky, held by a savage who had broken into his life and claimed him as his own. The swing ended with a bone-jarring impact as they crashed onto a lower rooftop. Kyle absorbed most of the force, his body shielding Elian's. They landed in a heap, Kyle immediately rolling back to his feet and pulling Elian up with him. "Move," he commanded. Already scanning their surroundings, Elian stumbled after him, his legs weak and trembling. The silk of his bonding robes, so pristine and symbolic just minutes ago, was now torn and stained, dragging on the gritty surface of the rooftop. He was cold. For the first time in his life, he was truly, painfully cold. The wind cut through the thin fabric, raising goosebumps on his skin. He looked back at the tower they had come from, at the dark, shattered hole that had been his window, his prison, his whole world. It already looked impossibly far away. He was outside. He was in the unregulated air, under the polluted, starless sky he had only seen in archives. He was running across a rooftop with a dangerous stranger, away from everything he had ever known. And, as he ran, a strange, hysterical feeling bubbled up in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was a terrifying, exhilarating surge of pure, unadulterated life. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was alive. And he was running. The journey was a fever dream, a chaotic montage of sensations that assaulted Elian's carefully sheltered system. They moved through the city's underbelly, a world he never knew existed beneath the gleaming, sterile surfaces. They descended through maintenance shafts that smelled of ozone and hot metal, their walls slick with condensation. They navigated forgotten service tunnels where the only light came from Kyle's wrist-mounted lumen, its beam cutting a stark path through the oppressive darkness. The air grew thick, humid, and filled with 1,000 new scents: machine oil, decay, the faint, lingering pheromones of countless people who lived and worked in the city's guts. For Elian, it was like being submerged in an ocean of raw data his brain couldn't pass. His head throbbed. Nausea churned in his stomach. The inhibitor Alistair had given him was a cold, dead weight in his system. But the world was still too much, too loud, too real. Kale never spoke, but his presence was a constant, solid anchor in the chaos. He moved with a predator's certainty, his hand always on Elian's arm, or the small of his back, guiding him, pulling him, steadying him. The contact was rough, impersonal, yet it was the only thing keeping Elian from collapsing. At one point, they emerged onto a crowded, lower-level thoroughfare. It was nothing like the silent, automated transitways of the upper sectors. This place teemed with life. People of all designations thronged the walkways, their faces weary, their clothes functional and patched. The air was thick with the smell of fried food, unrecycled air, and sweat. The noise was a physical blow, a cacophony of voices, clanging machinery, and tinny music from hidden speakers. Elian froze, overwhelmed. The sheer volume of human proximity was terrifying. He could feel the chaotic energy of their emotions, a discordant symphony his empathic senses had never been trained to handle. A beta worker jostled him, and Elian flinched back as if struck. Kyle's arm tightened around him, pulling him into his side, creating a shield against the press of the crowd. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice a low growl near Elian's ear. He pulled the hood of Elian's torn robe over his head, hiding his pale hair and distinctive features. They were a strange sight, the savage in tactical gear and the ghost in ruined white silk. But in the chaotic diversity of the lower levels, they barely drew a second glance. They finally reached a freight depot, a vast, cavernous space where automated cargo haulers hummed in and out of loading bays. Kyle led him to a rusty, dented hauler parked in a dark corner, its identification codes digitally scrambled. He pried open a side panel and bundled Elian inside, into a cramped space filled with crates of what smelled like engine lubricant. Kyle sealed the panel, plunging them into near-total darkness. The hauler shuddered to life, its engines vibrating through the floor. Elian huddled in the corner, his whole body trembling from cold and shock. The rhythmic jolting of the vehicle was the only constant in a world that had lost all its bearings. In the dark, the scent of the alpha was even more potent. It filled the small space, a territorial marker that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. The inhibitor in Elian's veins felt like a plug, a dam holding back a flood he couldn't comprehend. But he could feel the pressure building behind it. A strange, deep ache was starting in his joints, a phantom pain that had nothing to do with their violent escape. What do you want from me?" Elian finally managed to ask, his voice a thin, reedy thing. A rustle of movement in the dark, then Kyle's voice, closer than he expected. "I want what they stole." "Stole?" "You," Kyle said, the word blunt and heavy. "They take Omegas, the ones with the old bloodlines. They find them in the zones, or breed them in their labs, and they cleanse them, wipe their instincts, suppress their sense, turn them into dolls for their perfect, sterile world." Elian's mind recoiled from the words. He was not stolen. He was created. He was designed for a purpose. That was his truth. It had to be. "You're wrong," he whispered. "I was born for this. For the Union. You were born for more than being a broodmare, for a soulless suit," Kale retorted, his voice laced with a contempt so raw it was startling. "You think that numbness they give you is peace? It's a cage. They've locked you inside your own body." A sharp pain lanced through Elian's temples. The ache in his bones was intensifying. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. He curled into himself, wrapping his arms around his stomach. "Something's wrong," he gasped. "The inhibitor." Kyle shifted closer. Elian could feel his body heat in the cold air. "It's fighting you," he said, his voice softer now, less harsh. "Your body knows it's poison. It's trying to break free. It's going to hurt." The pain was growing, a deep, cellular agony. It felt like his entire being was at war with itself. The cold, clinical perfection of the inhibitor versus a furious, primal force that was clawing its way to the surface. He cried out, a thin, choked sound. A large, warm hand settled on his back, rubbing slow, firm circles. The touch was grounding, a point of focus in the rising tide of pain. "Breathe," Kyle commanded. "Just breathe through it." The journey continued for what felt like an eternity, with Elian lost in waves of pain and disorientation. He was vaguely aware of the hauler stopping, of being lifted and carried, of the air changing again, growing colder, cleaner, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. He was in the wild. He was in the feral zones. The old horror story from the archives. He was laid down on something soft, a pile of furs he dimly registered. A fire crackled nearby, its warmth a welcome relief against his chilled skin. He opened his eyes. They were in a cave, or some kind of rough-hewn shelter. The firelight danced on the damp stone walls, casting long, flickering shadows. Kale was kneeling beside him, wiping his face with a damp cloth. Elian flinched at the contact. "It's just water," Kale said, his voice calm. He looked different in the firelight. The harsh angles of his face were softened. The intensity in his eyes banked to a low glow. He looked worried. The pain in Elian's body was reaching a crescendo. It was a fire in his blood, a feeling of being stretched and torn apart from the inside. He could feel something shifting within him, a fundamental change. A scent, faint at first, began to permeate the air. It was not Kyle's scent of pine and winter. It was something else, something delicate and complex, the scent of rain on hot stones, of night-blooming jasmine, and a faint, metallic trace of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It was his. It was his own scent, raw and unfiltered, fighting its way past a lifetime of chemical suppression. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. He was coming undone. And in the process, he was finally, truly, becoming himself. The pain was a crucible, burning away the layers of his old self. For hours, or perhaps days, time had lost its meaning. Elian drifted in a fugue state, anchored only by the primal sensations of fire and agony. He was aware of Kyle's constant presence, a dark, watchful shape at the edge of his vision. He brought water, pressing a rough metal cup to Elian's cracked lips. He adjusted the furs, shielding Elian from the drafts that snaked through the rock shelter. He did not speak much, but his actions were a language Elian was slowly beginning to understand, a language of grim, determined care. During moments of lucidity, Elian would watch him. Kale would sit by the fire, sharpening his knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a hypnotic counterpoint to the crackle of the flames. His movements were economical, purposeful. There was no wasted energy, no artifice. He was a creature of his environment, as much a part of the wild as the wind and the rock. Elian's new scent, his true scent, grew stronger as the inhibitor was violently purged from his system. It filled the small cave, a delicate, complex fragrance that seemed to shimmer in the air. He was intensely aware of it and intensely ashamed. In the concordance, to have a scent was to be naked, to be vulgar. It was an uncontrolled broadcast of one's inner state. He tried to suppress it, to pull it back inside himself, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Kale seemed to notice his distress. One evening, as Elian lay exhausted and trembling in the aftermath of a particularly violent wave of withdrawal, Kale spoke. "Stop fighting it," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was tending to the fire, his back to Elian. "It's a part of you. It's your voice." "It's too much," Elian whispered, his throat raw. "It's how we know each other," Kyle continued, turning to look at him, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the firelight. "How we know who is friend, who is foe, who is in pain, who is joyful. The concordance calls it a weakness, a biological distraction. They lie. It's our strength. It's our truth." He picked up a small dried herb from a pouch at his belt and tossed it into the fire. A new aroma filled the air, sharp and cleansing, like mint and camphor. It mingled with Elian's scent, softening its edges, grounding it. "They taught you to be ashamed of what you are," Kale said. "Out here, it's the only thing that will keep you alive." As the pain began to subside, it was replaced by a profound, aching weakness. But beneath the weakness, something new was taking root. His senses, long dulled and suppressed, were awakening with an almost painful acuity. He could hear the drip of water deep within the cave, the skittering of some small creature outside. He could smell the mineral tang of the damp rock, the rich scent of the furs he lay on, the smoke from the fire, and Kale's constant, grounding presence. His own body felt alien to him. He was aware of the beat of his own heart, the flow of blood through his veins. He felt connected to himself in a way he had never been before. He was a finely tuned instrument, and the world was a symphony of sensations he was only just beginning to hear. One morning, he woke to find Kale gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He sat up, his head swimming. The fire was banked, glowing embers providing a soft warmth. He was alone. He pushed aside the furs, his bare feet meeting the cold, rough stone floor. The silk robes were gone. In their place lay a set of clothes similar to Kale's, soft, worn trousers and a tunic made of some kind of animal hide. They smelled faintly of Kale, of wood smoke and leather. Hesitantly, Elian addressed. The rough fabric was a strange sensation against his skin, which had only ever known frictionless synthetics. But it was warm. He felt solid, protected. He made his way to the mouth of the cave. The light outside was a soft grey dawn, filtered through a canopy of enormous trees. The air was cool and damp, and carried the scent of wet leaves and rich earth. It was the world from his dreams. He stepped outside. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The trees were titans, their branches reaching for a sky he could barely see. Everything was a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of green and brown. A bird called out, a sharp, melodic cry that echoed through the forest. Elian stood there, trembling, taking it all in. He was a creature of chrome and sterile white, set down in a world of overwhelming, organic life. He felt small. He felt breakable. He heard a sound and turned to see Kale emerging from the trees. He was carrying a brace of snared rabbits. He stopped when he saw Elian standing there, dressed in the new clothes. His expression was unreadable, but his scent shifted subtly. A brief flare of something warm and approving, like sunlight on pine needles, before it settled back into its usual reserve. "You're up," Kale stated, his voice flat. "I'm better," Elian said. It was an understatement. He felt scoured clean, remade. "Good," Kale grunted. He walked past Elian into the cave. "Eat. We move at midday. They'll be hunting us." The mention of they, of Alistair and the concordance, sent a chill through Elian, a phantom echo of his old fear. But it was different now. The fear was no longer a paralyzing, all-consuming force. It was a sharp, clear note in the symphony of his new awareness. It was something to be reacted to, not submitted to. He followed Kale back into the cave and watched as he skillfully prepared the rabbits. He ate the cooked meat Kale offered him, the rich, savory taste, an explosion in his mouth after a lifetime of nutrient paste. It was sustenance. It was life. And as he ate, he realized a profound truth. In the concordance, he had been safe, but he had not been alive. Here, in this dangerous, wild place, he was terrified. But for the first time in his entire existence, he was living. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was real. He could not go back. He would not go back. He had been a perfect object in a sterile display case. Now he was a flawed, frightened, living creature in a world that was vast and full of peril, and he had never felt more whole. The feral zones were a relentless education. Every step was a lesson in survival, a recalibration of Elian's entire being. Kale was a demanding, impatient teacher. He taught Elian how to walk without sound, how to read the subtle signs of the forest, a broken twig, a displaced stone, the scent of a predator on the wind. He taught him which plants were edible and which were poison, how to find clean water, how to build a shelter that would leave no trace. For Elian, whose life had been governed by timetables and automated systems, the chaotic, instinctual rhythm of the wild was a difficult language to learn. He was clumsy, inept. His pale skin, unused to the elements, burned and scratched easily. His muscles, developed for grace rather than endurance, ached with a deep, constant fatigue. More than once, he stumbled, his frustration and exhaustion bringing him to the verge of tears. But he never cried. The conditioning of the concordance ran deep, and the display of such overt emotion was a weakness he still could not permit himself. Kyle would watch his struggles with a detached, critical eye. He offered no sympathy, no words of encouragement. His only response to Elian's failures was a curt command or a practical demonstration. Yet his actions betrayed a different story. When Elian's soft boots, taken from the sanctum, were shredded by the rough terrain, he found a new pair waiting for him one morning, moccasins of supple, tough leather that fit him perfectly. When Elian shivered uncontrollably one night, despite the fire, Kale threw a heavy fur cloak over him without a word. It was a strange, gruff sort of care, and it confused Elian as much as it comforted him. Their conversations were sparse, functional. They spoke of the path ahead, of the weather, of the dwindling supplies. They never spoke of what they had left behind or what they were running toward. The silence between them was vast, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared trauma and uncertain future. But in that silence, a different kind of communication was taking place. Elian was learning to read Kale's scent as Kale had taught him to read the forest. He could detect the subtle shifts that signaled alertness, fatigue, or the rare, fleeting moments of calm. Kale's scent was a constant barometer of their situation, more honest and reliable than any words could be. And he knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Kale was just as aware of his own scent. He could feel the alpha's attention on him when his scent spiked with fear or frustration. He could sense the way Kale's own scent would subtly change in response, becoming more grounded, more dominant, a calming pheromonal anchor in the storm of Elian's emotions. One evening, they made camp in the ruins of an old-world structure, a skeleton of rusted steel and crumbling concrete slowly being reclaimed by the forest. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of rain. As Kyle built a fire in a sheltered corner of the ruin, Elian found something half buried in the dirt and moss. It was a shard of mirrored glass, perhaps from a window or a vehicle. He picked it up. His reflection was a distorted, fragmented thing. He saw a stranger with haunted eyes, his face smudged with dirt, his pale hair tangled with leaves. The perfect, polished asset from the sanctum was gone, replaced by this wild, feral creature. He looked real. He heard Kale approach and tried to hide the shard of glass, a reflexive flicker of his old shame. Kale stopped beside him, his gaze on the mirror in Elian's hand. "Do you miss him?" Kale asked, his voice unexpectedly quiet. Elian looked up, startled. "Miss who?" "The boy in the glass, the one they made." Elian stared back at the broken reflection. He thought of the sterile room, the silent meals, the heavy weight of Alistair's possessive hand. He thought of the profound, soul-deep loneliness. "No," Elian said, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised him. "He was never real. He was a ghost. He looked at Kale. The firelight flickered in his grey eyes. "Why did you take me?" he asked. The question that had been hovering between them for days. "You said they steal Omegas. Were you stolen?" Kyle's expression hardened. He turned away, staring out at the darkening forest. "My sister was," he said, his voice tight. "She was younger than me. They came during a foraging run. Enforcers. They said she had a rare genetic marker they needed. They called it a requisition. They took her, and we never saw her again. I was just a boy. I couldn't stop them." He clenched his fist. "I spent years tracking their patterns, learning their systems. I found out about their breeding programs. I found out they take the ones like my sister, the ones with potent bloodlines, and they recondition them. They turn them into you." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Elian finally understood. This was not just about instinct. It was not just a rescue. It was a reckoning. It was a hunt for a ghost. "You thought I was her," Elian said softly. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Kale was silent for a long moment. "Her scent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The records said it was like jasmine after a storm. When I broke into that room, even with the inhibitors, I could smell a trace of it. I thought, maybe." He finally turned back to face Elian. The grief in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "But you're not her. I know that now. Your scent is your own." He looked at Elian, a long, searching look. "I'm sorry," he said. "I dragged you into my war." A gust of wind howled through the ruins, and the first drops of rain began to fall, hissing in the fire. Elian looked from Kale's haunted face to the shard of glass in his hand. He was not Kale's sister. He was not Alistair's asset. He was not the ghost in the mirror. He was something new, something born of violence and desperation in the heart of the wild. "It's my war too," Elian said, his voice clear and steady above the rising storm. He let the shard of glass fall from his hand. It landed on the stone floor and shattered into a dozen smaller pieces, scattering the last remnants of his old reflection into the darkness. He was no longer looking back. The storm broke with the fury of a wounded god. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, and wind tore through the ruins with a mournful shriek. Thunder cracked overhead, the sound so loud it vibrated in Elian's bones, each clap followed by a stark, blue-white flash of lightning that bleached the world of color for a terrifying instant. Kale had built the fire in the most sheltered part of the structure, but the wind still found them, driving cold spray and dead leaves into their small alcove. The temperature plummeted. Elian, despite the leather tunic and the warmth of the fire, began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that racked his body. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to conserve what little heat he had. He was still not accustomed to the brutal realities of the elements. He saw Kale watching him, his brow furrowed. The alpha's scent was a complex mix of alertness from the storm and a low background hum of concern. He moved from his spot on the other side of the fire and sat down beside Elian. The sudden proximity was startling. The heat radiating from Kyle's body was a palpable force. "You're not built for this cold," Kyle stated, his voice a low rumble beneath the howl of the wind. Before Elian could respond, Kyle shrugged off the heavy fur cloak he wore and draped it around Elian's shoulders. The weight of it was immense, comforting. It smelled powerfully of kale, of pine and leather, and the unique warm scent of the alpha himself. The shivering began to subside, cocooned in the sudden, overwhelming warmth. "Thank you," Elian whispered, his voice small against the storm's fury. Kale just grunted in response, staring into the flames. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the roar of the storm and the crackle of the fire. The shared warmth, the enclosed space, the violence of the world outside, it created a strange, fragile pocket of intimacy. It was a level of physical closeness Elian had never experienced, not without the cold, clinical context of the Concordance's protocols. This was different. It was unplanned. It was human. "Alistair," Elian said, the name feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "He will not stop looking." Kale's jaw tightened. "I know. An asset like you is too valuable to lose. It's a mark against his record, a sign of imperfection." "It's not just that," Elian said, remembering the cold satisfaction in Alistair's eyes. "It's about control. He can't tolerate a variable he can't account for. Me, being out here with you, it's an error in his perfect system, and he will erase the error." A flash of lightning illuminated Kale's face, casting it in stark relief. The look in his eyes was grim, hard as flint. "Let him come," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is my world, not his. His technology, his enforcers. They're loud. They're clumsy. The forest will swallow them." Despite the confidence in his voice, Elian could smell the tension in him, the faint, sharp tang of adrenaline. He was not afraid, but he was preparing for a fight, and Elian knew with a sickening certainty that the fight was coming for them. The revelation of Kale's past had shifted something fundamental between them. Elian was no longer just a rescued captive. He was a living reminder of Kale's failure, of his loss, and Kale was no longer a mysterious, savage savior. He was a man driven by grief, hunting for a ghost he would never find. They were two broken pieces of a world they both despised, thrown together by fate and fury. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the ruin, and a section of the already fragile roof gave way, sending a cascade of debris and icy water down near their fire. They both flinched back. The fire hissed and sputtered, threatening to die. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted. Elian felt a strange, unfamiliar impulse. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he rested it on Kale's arm. The muscle beneath the worn fabric was hard as stone. Kale went rigid at the touch, his head snapping around to look at Elian. His eyes were wide with surprise. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't know why he had done it. It was an instinct he didn't know he possessed. A gesture of, what? Comfort? Solidarity? He didn't have the words for it. He only knew that in that moment he needed to make a connection, to affirm that they were in this together. He didn't pull his hand away. He met Kale's stormy gaze, his own violet eyes wide and earnest in the flickering firelight. Kale's scent flared, a sudden sharp spike of pine and something else, something wild and confusingly warm. For a long second, he did not move, did not breathe. Then slowly, as if moving against a great weight, he relaxed. He didn't pull away. He simply sat there, allowing the contact, a silent acceptance, a fragile truce in the heart of the storm. The fire held. The rain continued to fall. And for the first time, Elian did not feel like a captive. He did not feel like a burden. He felt like an ally. He felt like a partner. And as the storm raged outside, a quiet, tentative peace settled within the ruins of the old world. They were not safe. They were not free. But for tonight, they were not alone. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The world was washed clean, draped in a thick white mist that muffled all sound and clung to the skin in cold, damp droplets. It was a world of ghosts, of grey shapes and muted colours. The silence was unnerving. Kyle was tense, his body coiled like a spring, his senses on high alert. "The mist is a gift and a curse," he said, his voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the air. "It hides us, but it also hides them." They moved through the spectral forest like wraiths, Kale in the lead, Elian following in his footsteps. Elian's newfound sensory acuity was on fire. He could smell the damp earth, the wet bark, the decay of fallen leaves. But underneath it all, he could smell something else, a faint, alien scent that did not belong. The scent of sterilized air, of ozone from energy weapons, of the clinical metallic tang of concordance technology. They were close. His heart began to beat, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He felt Kale's hand on his arm, pulling him to a halt. The Alpha put a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the mist-shrouded trees ahead. Kyle's scent was sharp, focused, the scent of a predator that has caught the trail of its rival. He pointed to a ridge of rock to their left. It was a silent command. Climb. Get to high ground. The rock was slick with moisture, the handholds treacherous. Elian's hands, soft and uncalloused, were scraped raw as he pulled himself up. Kyle was right behind him, a solid presence, steadying him when his feet slipped. They reached the top of the ridge and crouched behind a cluster of weathered boulders. From here, they could look down into the small clearing below. And they were there. 3 of them. Concordance, enforcers, their white armor a jarring, unnatural sight against the organic greens and browns of the forest. They moved with stiff, programmed precision, their pulse rifles held at the ready. Their visored helmets swiveled back and forth, their optical sensors cutting through the mist. And with them was Alistair. He was not wearing armor. He stood in his severe, black High Counselor's uniform, seemingly impervious to the cold and damp. A transparent energy shield shimmered faintly around him, deflecting the mist. He held a data slate, his gaze fixed on the screen. He looked as calm, as controlled, as he had in the sanctum. A perfect, unmovable pillar of order in the heart of chaos. "The asset's biological signature is strong here," Alistair said, his voice amplified, cutting through the silence. It was the same temperate, inflectionless voice, but out here, in the wild, it sounded obscene, a violation of the natural quiet. "The inhibitors have completely failed. He is broadcasting." Elian flinched at the word broadcasting. Alistair spoke of his scent as if it were a rogue signal, a technical malfunction to be corrected. "Spread out," Alistair commanded the enforcers. "Triangulate the source. Standard retrieval protocol. I want the asset viable, but the feral alpha is expendable." Elian felt a surge of cold fury. Asset, feral, expendable. The clinical, dehumanizing language of the concordance. He was a thing to be retrieved. Kale was a pest to be exterminated. He looked at Kale. The alpha's face was a mask of cold rage. His hand rested on the grip of his kinetic pistol. He was preparing to fight, to die, against impossible odds. 3 armored enforcers and a High Counselor. It was suicide. In that moment, something inside Elian snapped. The last vestiges of the frightened, passive Omega shattered. He was not an asset. He was not a ghost. He was not a prize to be fought over by 2 alphas. He had a voice. He had a choice. And he had a weapon they had never anticipated. His scent, his truth. He looked at Kale, his violet eyes locking with the alpha's stormy grey. He put a hand on Kale's arm, a silent plea. "Wait. Trust me." Kyle hesitated, his eyes searching Elian's face. He saw the shift, the new hard resolve in his expression. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Elian took a deep breath. He closed his eyes and reached inside himself, to the core of his being where his scent was generated. He had spent the last few days unconsciously trying to suppress it, to mute it out of shame and fear. Now, he did the opposite. He let it go. He pushed it out, not as a broadcast, but as a focused wave. He poured all of his fear, his rage, his defiance, his desperate yearning for freedom into it. He remembered the phantom pain of the inhibitors, the cold terror of the sanctum, the possessive weight of Alistair's hand. He poured it all into his scent. The air around the ridge shimmered. His scent, the delicate fragrance of rain, jasmine and ozone, intensified 100-fold. But it was no longer delicate. It was a weapon. It was a scream. Down in the clearing, the enforcers stopped. One of them staggered, raising a hand to his helmet. "Pheromonal readings are off the scale," a distorted voice crackled. "Sensors are overloading." Alistair looked up from his slate, his calm expression finally cracking with a flicker of confusion. "What is this?" Elian pushed more. He focused on the enforcers. He had spent his life in a sterile environment. They had too. Their systems, their bodies, were not equipped to handle this level of raw, unfiltered biological data. He infused his scent with the memory of Kale's raw power, the terror of the fall, the chaos of the lower levels. He projected pure, emotional chaos. One of the enforcers dropped his rifle, clutching his head. The other began firing his weapon wildly, the energy bolts searing trees and rocks at random. "Stand down," Alistair commanded, his voice sharp with anger. "Maintain discipline." But it was too late. Their sanitized senses were overwhelmed. Their conditioning was short-circuiting. It was the ultimate irony. The Concordance's greatest strength, its sterile, controlled environment, had become its greatest vulnerability. Now, Elian opened his eyes, a silent signal to Kale. The Alpha moved, a blur of dark motion, vaulting over the boulders and down the rock face. He hit the ground running, his pistol already firing. The shots were not bolts of energy, but solid, kinetic slugs that slammed into the enforcer's armor with brutal, percussive force, staggering them, cracking their ceramic plates. Alistair's shield flared as a stray pulse bolt from one of his own men hit it. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked up at the ridge and saw Elian. For the first time, Alistair Vane, the man of perfect control, looked at his intended Omega and saw not an asset, but an enemy. Alistair's face was a study in controlled rage. The smooth, handsome features were twisted into a snarl of disbelief. The universe, for the first time in his life, was not conforming to his will. An error had occurred, and the error was standing on a ridge, defying him. "Elian," he shouted, his voice losing its modulated calm, cracking with fury. "Cease this display. You are dysregulated. You belong to me." The words, "belong to me," echoed in the clearing, more obscene than any profanity. They were the words of an owner, not a partner. They were the final confirmation of Elian's status in Alistair's world. He was property. While the two enforcers were disoriented, one firing blindly and the other on his knees, Kyle was a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He closed the distance to the kneeling enforcer, slamming the butt of his pistol into the man's helmet, sending him sprawling, unconscious. The second enforcer turned, finally locating a target, and fired his pulse rifle at Kyle. Kyle dove, rolling behind a Bai Shou moss-covered log as the bolt of energy vaporized the spot where he had been. Alistair, protected by his personal shield, drew a sleek, silver sidearm. It wasn't a pulse weapon. It was a neuro-disruptor, a weapon designed for subdual, not destruction. He aimed it at Kale. "The feral is the source of the contagion," he declared, his voice regaining its cold, clinical tone. "Neutralize the source, and the asset can be recalibrated." Elian knew he had to do more. The sensory attack was a distraction, but it wouldn't last. He scrambled down the rock face, his movements clumsy but desperate. He had to get closer. He had to face Alistair himself. He landed on the soft, damp earth of the clearing floor and ran, his heart pounding. "Alistair," he yelled, his voice raw. Alistair turned, his attention momentarily diverted from Kale. He saw Elian, his face smeared with dirt, his body clad in savage leathers, his eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly alien from the placid Omega he had curated, that he actually hesitated. "Elian, you are making a grave error," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This creature has infected you. Come with me now, and I will see that you are purified." "I am not a disease to be cured," Elian shouted, stopping a few yards from Alistair's shimmering shield. "And he did not infect me. He freed me." He took another deep breath and focused his scent again, but this time he did not project chaos. He projected truth. He sent Alistair the memory of the hollow silence in the sanctum, the cold finality of the inhibitor, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. He projected the utter soul-crushing emptiness of the perfection Alistair had designed for him. Alistair staggered back a step, his hand going to his temple. The data was not chaotic, it was specific, an empathic message so clear and potent that it bypassed his intellectual defenses and struck at something deeper. For a flicker of a second, he felt what Elian felt. The perfect emptiness. His composure shattered. "Lies," he hissed. "Pheromonal trickery." The distraction was enough. Kale burst from behind the log, his pistol firing. The kinetic slugs hammered against Alistair's shield, not penetrating, but causing it to flare violently with each impact. The shield was powered by a device on Alistair's belt, and under the sustained, brutal assault, it began to whine, the pitch rising higher and higher. The last conscious enforcer, recovering his senses, leveled his rifle at Elian. "Target acquired," he yelled. Before he could fire, a knife, thrown with impossible speed and accuracy, buried itself in the weak point of his neck seal. The enforcer made a gurgling sound and collapsed. Kale, his pistol empty, threw the useless weapon aside and charged Alistair, a savage roar tearing from his throat. He hit the shield with the force of a battering ram. The shield flared white, and Kale was thrown back, his body smoking. But the shield generator on Alistair's belt sparked and died. The shimmering barrier vanished. Alistair stood exposed, his neuro-disruptor still aimed at the downed Kale. But his eyes were on Elian. His face was a mask of cold, intellectual fury. He had lost. He had been outmaneuvered by a feral and a broken Omega. The imperfection was total. "If I cannot have you," he said, his voice flat and dead, "then no one will." He shifted his aim from Kyle to Elian. Elian froze, staring down the barrel of the weapon. This was it, the error being erased. He saw a flicker of motion from the corner of his eye. Kyle, pushing himself to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth, his body burned and bruised. He was too far away. He wouldn't make it. Time seemed to slow down. Elian looked at Alistair, at the man who was meant to be his future, his partner, his whole world. He saw nothing in his eyes. No passion, no love, no hate. Just the cold, empty logic of a failed equation being deleted. And Elian felt nothing. No fear. Just a strange, profound sense of pity for him. He had everything, and he was empty. The neuro-disruptor whined as it charged. In that final second, Elian did not cower. He stood tall, met Alistair's gaze, and gave him one last gift. He projected a final, potent wave of his scent. It was not anger or fear. It was the scent of the jasmine from his dreams, the scent of rain on stone, the scent of the wild, free forest around them. It was the scent of a life Alistair could never comprehend, a life he had tried to extinguish. It was the scent of everything Alistair had lost without ever knowing he had it. A shot rang out, not the whine of the disruptor, but the sharp crack of a kinetic rifle. A red flower bloomed on the chest of Alistair's perfect black uniform. His eyes went wide with surprise. He looked down at the stain, then back up at Elian, a look of profound, clinical confusion on his face. He crumpled to the ground, the neuro-disruptor falling from his lifeless fingers. Elian stood, trembling, as figures emerged from the mist-shrouded trees. They were not enforcers. They were people clad in the same rugged gear as Kyle, their faces grim, their weapons held at the ready. A woman with streaks of grey in her braided hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's lowered her rifle. She looked at Kale, then at Elian. Her scent was like dry earth and old leather, steady and calm. "Looks like you found one," she said to Kale, her voice dry. Kale staggered over to Elian, ignoring the newcomers. He gripped Elian's shoulders, his eyes searching his face, his scent a wild, frantic mix of relief and pain. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. Elian shook his head, unable to speak. He looked from Kale's battered face to the body of Alistair, a black and white stain on the forest floor. He was free. The thought was so immense, so terrifying, so beautiful. It stole his breath. He had faced his creator, his jailer, and he had not broken. He had not been recalibrated. He had won. He leaned into Kale, his forehead resting against the Alpha's chest, and finally, after a lifetime of perfect, placid control, Elian allowed himself to weep. The tears were a release, a violent, cathartic purging of a lifetime of unshed grief. He clung to Kale, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs, and for the first time, the Alpha's arms came around him, holding him not as a captive or an asset, but as a person. The embrace was awkward, hesitant, the embrace of a man unaccustomed to giving or receiving comfort. But it was real. It was a firm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of Elian's emotions. The woman with the rifle, her name was Mara, watched them with a patient, knowing gaze. She and her small band of resistance fighters, the ghosts of the zones, had been tracking the Concordance patrol for days. Kale's unsanctioned raid had been a reckless move, but it had led them right to a High Counselor. Alistair's death would send a shockwave through the Concordance's rigid command structure. It was a victory, but a costly one. Kale was injured, his arm badly burned by the energy shield, and they had revealed their presence. They could not stay. They retreated deeper into the zones, to a hidden settlement nestled in a network of caves behind a waterfall. It was a place of raw, vibrant life. Dozens of people, alphas, betas, and omegas, lived there, a community of outcasts and escapees, bound together by their shared defiance of the concordance. For Elian, it was another world of sensory overload, but this time it was not chaotic. It was a symphony. The air was rich with the sense of cooking fires, damp earth, and the complex, overlapping pheromones of a living community. He saw children playing, their laughter echoing off the cave walls. He saw alphas and omegas interacting not as masters and assets, but as partners, as equals. He saw a life he never knew was possible. He was an object of curiosity. His pale hair, his refined features, and his scent, so potent and pure after his cleansing, marked him as different. But there was no malice in their stares, only a wary sort of wonder. He met another Omega, an older man named Reese, who had been rescued from a concordance outpost years ago. Reese's scent was faded, like old parchment and dried herbs, and his eyes held a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "It takes time," Reese told him, his voice gentle, "to learn to trust your own skin again, to understand that your instincts are not a flaw to be corrected. They are your guide." Kale's burns were treated by the settlement's healer, his arm bound in poultices of crushed leaves. He was quiet, withdrawn, brooding over the battle and its consequences. The ghost of his sister was a palpable presence between them, a sorrow that had been the catalyst for Elian's freedom, but remained a wound that would never fully heal for Kyle. Elian found him one evening, standing on a ledge that overlooked the valley, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The view was breathtaking, a masterpiece of natural, untamed beauty. "You blame yourself," Elian said, standing beside him. It was not a question. Kale didn't look at him. "I was reckless. I put you in danger. I put my people in danger. All for a ghost." "You saved me," Elian said softly. "Whatever your reasons were, you saved me from a life that was not a life at all. You gave me this." He gestured to the vast, beautiful world before them. "I am not your sister, Kale. I can never replace what you lost. But I am not a ghost. I am here." Kyle finally turned to look at him. In the warm light of the setting sun, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He saw Elian, truly saw him, not as a symbol of his loss or a mission to be completed, but as the person standing before him, scarred, terrified, but fiercely, incandescently alive. "I know," Kale said, his voice rough. His scent, for the first time, was not one of grief or rage or alertness. It was something new, something calm and deep, like the scent of the forest after the rain has stopped. It was the scent of acceptance. The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. The concordance would not forget the death of a high counselor. They would hunt for the settlement, for the fugitives who had defied their perfect order. The war was far from over. Safety was a luxury they would never know. But as Elian stood on that ledge, the cool evening air on his face, the scent of the wild world in his lungs, and the steady, solid presence of the alpha beside him, he did not feel fear. He felt a quiet, trembling hope. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Kale's. It was a small, hesitant gesture. Kale's hand, calloused and strong, closed around his. The touch was warm, grounding. It was not a claim. It was not an act of possession. It was a connection, a quiet promise in the twilight. They were not an asset and a feral. They were not a master and a slave. They were two survivors standing on the edge of a broken world with nothing left to hold on to but each other. And for now, that was enough. The path forward was shrouded in mist, but for the first time in his life, Elian was not afraid of the shadows. He was ready to walk into them. He was finally and completely free.